herself she was giving up in the complete subservience. This, in turn, made her think of the schedule as a sort of tyranny, and several times lately she had wondered how much of herself she was giving up in the complete subservience of every hour of every day to another's judgment. He can call for Noel, she decided. I've done my best all through. If he's so wise, he ought not to put me in such a situation. An hour ought not to put me in such a situation. An hour later, Renee was still unable to think where he had put her at all. He had planned the days for her, but he had never really thought before about how she would fill them up. Returning to his laboratory in a state of profound gloom, he increased his pace as he came in sight of the building, cursed with a new anxiety. He had been absent more than 3 hours, with the barometer steadily falling and 3 windows open. He could not remember whether he or Charles was to have spoken to the janitor about continuing the heat over the weekend. His jars, the precious water in his jars, he ran up the icy stairs of the old building, afraid of what he was going to see. One closed jar went with the stairs of the old building, afraid of what he was going to see. One closed jar went with a cracking plop as he stood panting inside the door. 1,000 of them glistened in tents rose through 3 long rooms, and he held his breath, waiting for them to go off together, almost hearing the crackling, despairing sound they would make. He saw that another one was broken, and then another in a far row. The room was like ice, with a blizzard seeping through 8 corners of every window. There was ice formed on the faucet. On tiptoe, less of every window, there was ice formed on the faucet. On tiptoe, lest even a faint movement precipitate the 997 catastrophes, he retreated to the hall. Then his heart beat again as he heard the dull, reassuring rumble of the janitor's shovel in the cellar. Fire it up as far as you can, he called down, and then descended another flight so as to be sure he was understood. Make it as hot a blaze as possible, even if it is all, he could not think of the word for kindling, even if it is all small wood. He hurried back to the laboratory, entering again on tiptoe. As he entered, 2 jars beside a north window cracked, but his hand, brushing the radiator, felt just the beginning of a faint and tepid warmth. He took off his overcoat, and then his coat, and tucked them in across one window, dragged out an emergency electric heater, and then turned on every electric appliance in the room. From moment to moment, he stopped and listened ominously, but there were no more of the short, disastrous dying cries. By the time he had isolated the 5 broken jars and checked up on the amount of ice in the others, there was a definite pulse of heat coming off the radiators. As he still fussed mechanically around the room, his hands shaking, he heard Noelle's voice in a lower hall, and she came upstairs with Dolores Hume, both of them bundled to the ears against the cold. "Here you are, Renee," Dolores said in a lower hall, and she came upstairs with Dolores Hume, both of them bundled to the ears against the cold. "Here you are, Renee," Dolores said cheerfully. "We've phoned here 3 times and all over town. We wanted Noelle to stay to dinner, but she keeps thinking you'd be worried. What is all this about a schedule? Are you all catching trains? What is what? He answered dazedly. You realize, Dolores, what has happened here in this room? Answered dazedly. You realize, Dolores, what has happened here in this room? It's got very cold. The water in our jars froze. We almost lost them all. He heard the furnace door close, and then the janitor coming upstairs. Furious at what seemed the indifference of the world, he repeated. We nearly lost them all. Well, as long as you didn't, Dolores fixed her eyes upon a vague spot far down the late battlefield of gleaming jars. Since we're here, Renee, I want to say something to you, a thing that seems to me quite as important as your jars. There is something very beautiful about a widower being left alone with a little daughter to care for and to protect and to guide. It doesn't seem to me that anything so beautiful should be lightly destroyed. For the second time that day, Renee started to throw his hands up in the air, but he had stretched his wrists a little the last time, and in his profound agitation he was not at all sure that he could catch them. There is no answer, he grunted to throw his hands up in the air, but he had stretched his wrists a little the last time, and in his profound agitation he was not at all sure that he could catch them. There is no answer, he groaned. Listen, Dolores, you must come to my laboratory often. There is something very beautiful in a platinum electrode. I am thinking only of Noel, said Dolores serenely. At this point, the janitor, effectually concealed beneath a thick mask of coal dust, came into the room. It was Noel who first divined the fact that the janitor was Becky Snyder. And Becky was announced to the world as personified and represented by Dolores Hume. Under those thoroughly unmethodical circumstances, the engagement of Renee and Becky was announced to the world as personified and represented by Dolores Hume. Under those thoroughly unmethodical circumstances, the engagement of Renee and Becky was announced to the world as personified and represented by Dolores Hume. But for Renee even that event was overshadowed by his astonishment at learning that the first jar had burst at the moment Becky came into his laboratory, that she had remembered that water expanded as it froze and guessed at the danger, that she had been working for 3/4 of an hour to start the furnace before he had arrived, and, finally, that she had taken care of the furnace for 2 years back in Bingham, because there was nothing much else to do. Dolores took it nicely, though she saw fit to remind Becky that she would be somewhat difficult to recognize if constantly observed under such extremely contrary conditions. I suppose it all has something to do with this schedule I hear so much about. I started the fire with the schedule, remarked Becky, and then amended herself when Renee jumped up with a suddenly agonized expression. Not the one with the notes on it, that was behind the cushions of the car. It's too much for me, Dolores admitted. That was behind the cushions of the car. It's too much for me, Dolores admitted. I suppose you'll all end by sleeping here tonight, probably in the jars. Noelle bent double with laughter. Why don't we look on the schedule, Daddy, and see if that's the thing to do? On